Abigail Monroe clutched the edge of the worn kitchen table, her knuckles white with tension as her father's words hung in the air like a death sentence. "You'll marry him, and that's final." Frederick Monroe's voice boomed through their modest homestead, drowning out the gentle whisper of the prairie wind outside. "I will not," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. At 22, she had long since given up the girlish dreams of a love match, but this being traded like cattle for a parcel of land was beyond what even her practical nature could bear. "I am not property to be bartered away." The year was 1875, and the untamed expanse of the Wyoming Territory offered both opportunity and hardship in equal measure. For Frederick Monroe, a man haunted by debt and drought, the 500 acres offered by Bernard Holloway in exchange for his daughter's hand seemed like salvation. For Abigail, it was nothing short of imprisonment. "You ungrateful girl!" Frederick slammed his fist against the table, causing the tin plates to rattle. "After all I've done for you since your mother passed, what do you think will happen to this farm without Holloway's land?" "We'll be ruined by winter's end." Abigail's throat tightened. "Mr. Holloway is 63 years old, father. He's buried 2 wives already." "And he's the wealthiest man in 3 counties," Frederick countered, his weathered face flushed with anger. "He can give you security I never could." "I'd rather work my fingers to the bone than be sold for acres," Abigail said, rising from her chair. Her honey-brown hair, normally neatly pinned, had come loose during their argument, framing her face with wavy tendrils that only emphasized her determined expression. Frederick's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about what you want. The deal is made. Holloway will be here tomorrow to finalize the arrangement." Outside, a horse nickered softly. Both Monroes turned toward the window, where the silhouette of a rider appeared against the setting sun. Abigail moved first, grateful for the interruption, and opened the door to find a tall figure dismounting from a dappled gray stallion. "Evening, Miss Monroe," came a deep voice as the man removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Mason Blackwood," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "I was hoping to speak with your father about some cattle business." Abigail had seen him before one of the hands from the Double Cross Ranch to the north. He was new to the area, having arrived only last spring, but his reputation as a skilled horseman and fair dealer had already taken root among the scattered homesteads. "Mr. Blackwood," Frederick acknowledged, appearing behind his daughter. "What brings you to our door so late?" Mason replaced his hat, squinting against the fading light. "Mr. Decker sent me to inquire about your bull. He's interested in stud services for his heifers." Frederick grunted. "Come inside, then. No sense talking business in the yard." Abigail stepped aside, noticing how Mason's tall frame seemed to fill their modest home with an unspoken strength. He smelled of leather, horses, and the open prairie, a clean scent that contrasted sharply with Bernard Holloway's suffocating cologne. As the men settled at the table, Abigail busied herself preparing coffee, her mind racing. Perhaps she could escape tonight, make her way to the stagecoach station in Rivercross. She had a little money saved, enough for passage to her cousin's home in Colorado, maybe. "Finest bull in the county," her father was saying, pride momentarily displacing his earlier anger. "Sired 6 calves last season, all healthy." "That's exactly why Mr. Decker's interested," Mason replied, accepting the coffee Abigail placed before him with a quiet thank you. "Though I hear congratulations might be in order for you as well, Mr. Monroe." Frederick's brow furrowed. "Congratulations." "Bernard Holloway was in town earlier, boasting about acquiring your north fields," Mason explained, his eyes flickering briefly to Abigail. said something about a family arrangement. The room grew still. Abigail could feel the weight of Mason's gaze, assessing, questioning. News travels fast, Frederick muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Nothing's finalized yet. I see. Mason took a slow sip of his coffee. Holloway mentioned the terms were unusual. Abigail's cheeks burned with humiliation. So the whole town knew. She was to be traded like livestock, her future discussed over whiskey at the saloon. My arrangements with Holloway aren't your concern, Blackwood, Frederick snapped. Now about that bull, actually, Mason interrupted, setting down his cup with deliberate care. I'm more interested in hearing the terms of this land deal. The tension in the room thickened. Frederick's jaw clenched. As I said, it's private business. Perhaps, Mason conceded. But when a man boasts in public about acquiring a wife along with property, it becomes something else entirely. Abigail's sharp intake of breath was the only sound for several heartbeats. Mason's steady gaze never left Frederick's reddening face. My daughter understands her duty to this family, Frederick finally said, his voice strained. Holloway's offer is generous. And what exactly is that offer? Mason pressed, leaning forward slightly. If you don't mind my asking. Frederick hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. 500 acres adjoining our property. Good land, well watered. In exchange for your daughter's hand in marriage, Mason finished, his expression unreadable. Yes. The single word fell heavy between them. Mason nodded slowly, then reached for his hat, placing it on the table between them. I have a counter-offer, Mr. Monroe. Abigail froze by the stove, her heart hammering against her ribs. I don't recall asking for offers, Frederick growled. Hear me out, Mason said calmly. The Double Cross has 1,200 acres, Mr. Decker is willing to lease 300 of them to you, prime grazing land with water rights at a fair price. You can expand your herd, generate real income. Frederick's eyes narrowed suspiciously. And what would Decker want in return for such generosity? Nothing from you, Mason replied, his gaze shifting to Abigail. But I'm offering myself in place of your agreement with Holloway. The world seemed to tilt beneath Abigail's feet. She gripped the back of a chair for support, certain she had misheard. What are you saying, Blackwood? Frederick demanded. Mason's voice remained steady. I'm saying that instead of trading your daughter to Holloway for land, you accept Decker's offer of leased property. And if Miss Monroe requires a husband to secure her future, I'm volunteering for that position. You, Frederick scoffed. A ranch hand with nothing to his name. I have savings, Mason countered. Enough to build a house on the parcel Decker's willing to grant me as part of my wages. It's smaller than Holloway's offer, but it would be ours free and clear within 5 years. This is absurd, Frederick muttered, though Abigail could see calculation replacing outrage in his eyes. You barely know my daughter. I know enough, Mason said simply. I know she deserves better than being bartered away to a man 3 times her age. Abigail's mind whirled with confusion. Why would this man, practically a stranger, insert himself into their affairs this way? What could he possibly gain? And if I refuse? Frederick asked. Mason reached for his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. Then I'll be forced to share with the territorial judge my concerns about coerced marriages. He takes a dim view of such arrangements. The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. Frederick's face darkened with anger, but Abigail could see fear there too. Her father had always been careful to maintain his reputation in the community. You do that. Risk everything for a woman you hardly know. Frederick's disbelief was evident. Mason's expression remained impassive. I've seen enough injustice in this world, Mr. Monroe. I don't need to witness more. Frederick turned to Abigail, his eyes calculating. And you? Would you prefer this arrangement to Holloway's offer, The question struck her like a physical blow. Neither option had been her choice, yet one clearly offered more dignity than the other. She straightened her spine, meeting Mason's gaze directly for the first time. His eyes held no demand, only a quiet assurance that surprised her. "If these are my only options," she said carefully, "then yes, I would prefer Mr. Blackwood's proposal." Mason nodded once, a gesture so slight she might have imagined it. Frederick pushed away from the table with a grunt. "I'll need to think on this. Nothing's decided tonight." "Holloway arrives tomorrow," Mason reminded him. "I'll return in the morning for your answer." As he rose to leave, Abigail followed him to the door, slipping outside onto the porch while her father remained grumbling at the table. "Why?" she whispered once they were alone in the gathering darkness. "Why would you do this?" Mason secured his hat, his features half hidden in shadow. "No one should be traded like property, Miss Monroe." "But marriage," she began. "Would be in name only if that's your wish," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering protection, not demanding anything in return." Abigail studied him in the faint moonlight, searching for deception and finding none. "I don't understand." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "You don't need to understand tonight, just know you have choices now." With that, he mounted his horse and rode into the night, leaving Abigail standing on the porch with her thoughts in turmoil, and an unfamiliar feeling blooming in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. Dawn broke over the Monroe homestead in pale streaks of pink and gold, illuminating the dew-kissed prairie grass that stretched toward the distant mountains. Abigail had barely slept, her mind replaying Mason Blackwood's unexpected proposal over and over. She rose early, dressing with care in her best calico dress, a faded blue that brought out the hints of amber in her hazel eyes. Her father was already at the table when she emerged from her small bedroom, his expression thunderous as he nursed a cup of coffee. He didn't look up when she entered. "I've considered Blackwood's offer," he said finally, his voice gruff with reluctance. "It's not as advantageous as Holloway's land, but it might do." Relief flooded through Abigail, making her knees weak. She sank into a chair opposite him. "Thank you, Father." Frederick's eyes snapped up, hard and unyielding. "Don't thank me yet, I have conditions." The momentary hope faltered. "What conditions?" "You'll marry him immediately today if possible. I won't have you changing your mind and leaving me with nothing." He took a long swallow of coffee. "And the lease agreement with Decker must be signed before any vows are exchanged." Abigail nodded slowly. She had expected as much. "And what of Mr. Holloway?" A flash of discomfort crossed Frederick's face. "I'll deal with Holloway. You concern yourself with being ready when Blackwood returns." The hours that followed passed in a blur of activity. Abigail packed her meager belongings, her mother's silver hand mirror, a few dresses, the quilt her grandmother had made, all while trying to calm the storm of emotions within her. She was escaping one arranged marriage only to enter another. Yet something about Mason Blackwood's quiet dignity gave her courage. Mid-morning brought the sound of approaching horses. Abigail's heart leapt to her throat as she peered through the window to see Mason riding alongside an older man she recognized as James Decker, owner of the Double Cross. Behind them came a wagon driven by a young woman with fiery red hair. Frederick strode out to meet them, his posture stiff with pride despite the circumstances. Abigail hung back, watching through the doorway as the men exchanged terse greetings. "Miss Monroe," James Decker called, tipping his hat when he spotted her hovering in the doorway. "A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. I've brought my daughter, Margaret, to assist you." The red-headed woman jumped down from the wagon with surprising grace, offering Abigail a warm smile. "Everyone calls me Maggie," she said, approaching with outstretched hands. Mason told us you might need some feminine company today. Before Abigail could respond, the thunder of another horse approaching drew everyone's attention. Bernard Holloway appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward the homestead. "Looks like we have company," Decker observed dryly. Mason dismounted, positioning himself casually between the approaching rider and the house. "Perhaps the ladies should step inside while we handle this." Maggie linked her arm through Abigail's, drawing her back into the house. "Come on, let the men posture while we get acquainted." Through the window, Abigail watched as Holloway reined his horse to a stop, his florid face contorted with anger when he spotted Decker and Mason. "Monroe," he bellowed. "What's the meaning of this? We had an agreement." Frederick stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Now, Bernard, I was coming to see you with papers signed and ready, I expected." Holloway cut him off, his gaze sweeping over the gathering before landing on the house. "Where's the girl? Already hiding my future wife away, Decker." James Decker's voice carried clearly through the open window. "Miss Monroe won't be marrying you, Holloway. There's been a change of plans." Holloway's face darkened to a dangerous red. "A change? You think you can interfere in my business, Decker? That land should be mine." "Land can be bought," Mason interjected calmly. "Women cannot." Inside, Maggie whistled low under her breath. "That Mason always did have a way with words when it mattered," she murmured, squeezing Abigail's arm reassuringly. "You," Holloway pointed a trembling finger at Mason. "The hired help thinks to lecture me on property." "Monroe, are you actually listening to this drifter over our arrangement?" Frederick shifted uncomfortably. "Decker's made a compelling offer, Bernard. Better terms for my cattle operation." "And your daughter," Holloway sneered. "Who gets that prize in this new arrangement?" Mason stepped forward, his voice level but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Miss Monroe has agreed to marry me, Mr. Holloway. That matter is settled." The silence that followed was broken only by Holloway's harsh breathing. Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. "This is outrageous," Holloway finally sputtered. "You can't simply—" "I believe I can," Frederick interrupted, finding his backbone at last. "My daughter is of age and she's chosen Blackwood. The arrangement with Decker benefits us both." Holloway's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "I don't take kindly to being made a fool, Monroe." In one fluid motion, Mason shifted his stance, his own hand resting casually near his holster. The movement was subtle, but the message was clear. "No one's making you a fool but yourself, Holloway," Decker said mildly. "Now, I suggest you turn that horse around and head home before this gets unpleasant." For a moment, Abigail feared Holloway would draw his weapon. Instead, he spat on the ground at Frederick's feet. "You'll regret this, Monroe," he growled. "Both of you will." His gaze swept over Mason with contempt before he yanked his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Maggie released a breath. "Well, that was exciting. Are all your family gatherings so dramatic, Abigail?" Despite the tension, Abigail found herself smiling at Maggie's irreverent tone. "Not usually, no." Outside, the men were already moving on, Decker producing papers from his saddlebag. "Shall we make this official, Monroe? I've brought the lease agreement as promised." As the men gathered around the worn kitchen table to sign documents, Maggie guided Abigail toward the wagon. "I've brought a few things for you, a dress my mother made, some ribbons for your hair. Nothing fancy, but a bride should have something special, don't you think?" "Bride," Abigail repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "I hardly know him, Maggie." The redhead paused, her green eyes serious for the first time. "Mason Blackwood is the finest man I know, Abigail. My father took him in 5 years ago when he had nothing but the clothes on his back and that gray stallion of his. He's worked harder than any two men combined, never complains, never takes advantage." She smiled softly. "And he's been watching you for months, though he'd probably shoot me for telling you that." "Watching me?" Abigail echoed, startled. "At church socials, in town when you're shopping. Never in an improper way," Maggie hastened to add. "More like he was memorizing you, trying to work up the courage to introduce himself properly." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I had no idea. Men like Mason don't announce their feelings with grand gestures, at least, not usually." Maggie's smile turned wry. "Though I suppose offering himself in marriage to save you from Holloway counts as fairly grand." Before Abigail could respond, the door opened and the men emerged, Frederick looking both relieved and somehow diminished, as though the weight of his debt had been lifted but at the cost of his pride. "It's done," he announced gruffly. "Decker's lease begins immediately. Blackwood, you'd best take my daughter to the preacher before sundown. I've sent word to Reverend Walsh that you'll be coming." Mason nodded, his eyes finding Abigail's across the yard. "If that suits you, Miss Monroe." There was that choice again, the one he kept offering when others simply made demands. Abigail straightened her shoulders and moved toward him. "Yes," she said simply. "It suits me." The small church in Rivercross stood on a gentle rise overlooking the town, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Abigail sat beside Mason in Decker's wagon, Maggie chattering behind them to fill the silence that had fallen between the soon-to-be newlyweds. "Reverend Walsh will be pleased. He's always saying young people don't marry quickly enough these days," Maggie was saying. "Though I suppose most folks have a longer courtship than a single day." "Maggie," her father admonished gently from his horse alongside the wagon. Perhaps less commentary would be appreciated. Abigail found herself smiling despite her nerves. "It's all right, Mr. Decker. Maggie's honesty is refreshing." Mason guided the horses with confident hands, his profile strong against the backdrop of the western sky. He'd changed into a clean shirt and vest, his usually unruly hair tamed somewhat for the occasion. "You look nice," Abigail ventured, breaking their silence at last. A hint of color touched his tanned cheeks. "Thank you." He glanced at her, then quickly back at the road. "You're beautiful, Miss Monroe." The simple compliment, delivered with such earnest awkwardness, touched something deep within her. This man, who had inserted himself into her life with such determination, now seemed almost shy in her presence. "I think, given the circumstances, you should call me Abigail," she said softly. His hands tightened momentarily on the reins. "Abigail," he repeated, as though testing the shape of her name. "And I'm Mason." A small connection, but it felt significant as they approached the church where their lives would be bound together. Reverend Walsh was waiting on the church steps, his wife beside him with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Monroe," he greeted them warmly. "I understand congratulations are in order." The ceremony itself was brief but dignified. Abigail stood beside Mason before the simple altar, repeating vows that generations of women had spoken before her. When Mason slid a simple gold band onto her finger, where had he gotten a ring on such short notice? His hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I, Mason, take thee, Abigail, to be my lawfully wedded wife." His voice, deep and sure, filled the small church. There was no deception in his gaze, no hint that this was merely a business arrangement. For a moment, Abigail could almost believe this was a marriage built on mutual affection rather than desperate circumstances. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Walsh announced after they had both said their vows. Abigail's breath caught as Mason hesitated, then leaned forward to place the gentlest of kisses against her lips. It lasted only a moment, but the warmth of it lingered as they turned to face their small audience, the Deckers, Reverend Walsh and his wife, and two elderly women who had been arranging flowers when they arrived and stayed to witness the ceremony. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mason murmured as they walked back down the aisle. "How does it sound, Abigail Blackwood?" The name echoed in her mind, strange yet not unpleasant. "It sounds like a new beginning," she replied honestly. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Maggie embraced Abigail warmly. "Welcome to the family," she said, her eyes bright with genuine happiness. "You'll come stay with us until your house is built, of course." "I thought," Abigail glanced at Mason, confusion evident in her expression. "If that's acceptable to you," he said quickly. "Mr. Decker has offered his home until our cabin is finished. I've been working on it for several weeks, but it's not quite ready." Several weeks. Abigail's mind whirled with this new information. Had he been building a home for himself all this time, or had he somehow anticipated this turn of events? As if reading her thoughts, Mason added, "I was planning to establish my own place on Decker land. The timing is fortunate." James Decker clapped a hand on Mason's shoulder. "Been trying to get this one to settle down for years. Never thought it would happen quite like this, but the Lord works in mysterious ways." The ride to the Double Cross Ranch was filled with Maggie's plans for making Abigail comfortable and James Decker's stories about the property. Mason remained mostly quiet, occasionally adding a detail or answering a direct question. Abigail found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands handled the reins with such confidence, the occasional glance he cast in her direction when he thought she wouldn't notice. The ranch itself was impressive, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and cattle grazing on the rolling hills beyond. As they approached, several ranch hands emerged from the barn, curiosity evident on their faces. "Boys," Decker called out, "come meet Mason's bride." Abigail felt herself flush under the scrutiny of the cowboys, who removed their hats and nodded respectfully. One stepped forward with a wide grin. "Well, I'll be damned sorry, madam, but Mason actually did it." He extended a calloused hand. "Tom Wilson, madam. Known this fool for 4 years and never thought I'd see the day." Mason cleared his throat. "Tom, this is Abigail, my wife." The words sounded strange coming from his lips, as though he too was adjusting to their new reality. "Mrs. Decker." A plump, pleasant woman with Maggie's red hair faded to copper appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "There you are. I was beginning to worry. Come in, supper's nearly ready, and I've prepared the blue room for you both." Abigail felt a flutter of panic at the mention of shared accommodations. She glanced at Mason, who seemed equally uncomfortable. "I can take the bunkhouse," he offered quietly as they followed the Deckers toward the house. "Nonsense," Maggie whispered from behind them. "You're married now. People will talk if you're separated on your wedding night." Wedding night. The words sent a jolt of awareness through Abigail's body. Of course, that's what people would expect. She and Mason, alone together. The blue room, as it turned out, was a cozy chamber on the second floor of the Decker home, dominated by a large 4-poster bed with a handmade quilt. Mrs. Decker bustled about, showing Abigail where fresh towels were kept and explaining that the washroom was just down the hall. "I'll leave you to freshen up before supper," she said kindly, patting Abigail's hand. "You must be overwhelmed, dear. What a whirlwind day." When they were finally alone, an awkward silence descended. Mason stood by the window, looking out over the ranch, while Abigail perched on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted in her lap. "I meant what I said," he finally spoke, his back still to her. "I can sleep elsewhere. The marriage is real in law, but I won't. That is, I don't expect." "Thank you," Abigail said softly, "but Maggie's right. People will talk." He turned then, his expression solemn. "I don't care what people say about me, Abigail. Your comfort is what matters." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. This man who had stepped into her life so suddenly seemed determined to protect not just her physical well-being but her dignity as well. "Perhaps," she ventured carefully, "we could share the room but not the bed itself, for appearances." Mason nodded, relief evident in his expression. "I'll make a pallet on the floor." "That seems unnecessary when the bed is so large," Abigail said before she could reconsider. "We could both use it, with a proper division." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "A proper division, pillows," she explained, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Down the middle." He inclined his head in agreement. "As you wish." Supper with the Deckers was a lively affair, with Maggie dominating the conversation and her parents interjecting occasionally with stories about Mason's early days on the ranch. Abigail learned that he had come from Missouri originally, had fought briefly in the latter days of the Civil War despite being barely 17, and had worked his way west afterward. "Never met a horse he couldn't gentle," James Decker said proudly. "And the man can track anything that leaves a print." "Pa," Mason protested mildly, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's true," Maggie insisted. "Last winter when those rustlers took our best breeding bulls, Mason tracked them through a snowstorm and brought back every last one." As the evening progressed, Abigail found herself relaxing in the warm family atmosphere. The Deckers treated her like a welcome addition rather than an interloper, and Mason, though still reserved, seemed more at ease among these people who clearly respected him. Later, as they prepared for bed, the awkwardness returned. Mason had excused himself while Abigail changed into the nightgown Maggie had lent her, returning only after a soft knock and her permission to enter. He had removed his boots and vest, but remained otherwise fully clothed. "I'll just—" He gestured vaguely at the bed. Together, they arranged a line of pillows down the center of the mattress, creating a symbolic barrier between them. Abigail slipped under the covers on her side, trying not to notice how the mattress dipped when Mason settled on his. "Good night, Abigail," he said softly, blowing out the lamp. "Good night, Mason," she whispered into the darkness. She lay awake for a long time, listening to his steady breathing across the pillow divide, wondering how her life had changed so dramatically in the space of 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been Abigail Monroe, facing a future as Bernard Holloway's unwilling bride. Tonight, she was Abigail Blackwood, lying beside a virtual stranger who had rescued her from that fate yet demanded nothing in return. What kind of man does such a thing? She wondered as sleep finally began to claim her, and what kind of marriage might grow from such an unusual beginning. The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle golden light across the room. Abigail stirred, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day rushed back, as she became aware of the warm presence beside her, or rather, on the other side of the pillow barrier. Mason was already awake, lying on his back with one arm folded behind his head, staring at the ceiling. He turned at her movement, his eyes finding hers in the early morning light. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. She smoothed a hand over her hair, aware that it had mostly escaped its braid during the night. An awkward silence settled between them, broken only when a rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. "I should," Mason began. "You," Abigail said simultaneously. They both stopped, sharing a small, tentative smile. "Ladies first," Mason offered. Abigail sat up, keeping the quilt tucked around her. "I was just going to ask if you slept well." "Well enough," he answered, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "And you, the same." She hesitated, then added, "It's strange, isn't it? Being married to someone you barely know." Mason sat up as well, careful to maintain the pillow boundary between them. "Strange," he agreed, "but not unheard of in these parts. My own parents barely knew each other when they wed." "And were they happy?" Abigail asked, curious about this glimpse into his past. A shadow crossed his face. "For a time. My mother died when I was 12, fever." "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. "I lost my mother 3 years ago, pneumonia." Something shifted in Mason's expression, a recognition of shared experience, perhaps. "It leaves a hole that never quite fills, doesn't it?" Abigail nodded, unexpectedly moved by his understanding. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. "Breakfast in 20 minutes," Maggie's cheerful voice called through the wood. "Don't be late, or Pa will eat all the flapjacks." The moment broken, they prepared for the day with careful courtesy, taking turns using the washroom down the hall. By the time they joined the Deckers downstairs, Abigail had pinned her hair neatly and donned one of her simpler dresses, while Mason was dressed for ranch work in worn denims and a fresh shirt. "There's the newlyweds," James Decker greeted them warmly. "Sleep well." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, but managed a polite nod as Mason pulled out a chair for her at the table. "Mason, I thought you might show Abigail around the ranch today," Mrs. Decker suggested as she placed a platter of flapjacks in the center of the table. "She should see where you've been working all these months." "If you'd like to," Mason said, glancing at Abigail. "I would," she replied, genuinely interested in learning more about the place that had been his home. After breakfast, Mason led her outside, where his gray stallion and a gentle-looking chestnut mare waited, already saddled. "Maggie thought you might like to ride Thunder," Mason explained, indicating the chestnut. "She's even-tempered but spirited when you need her to be." Abigail approached the mare, stroking her velvety muzzle. "She's beautiful." She glanced at Mason's stallion, who stood tall and proud beside his master. "And yours?" "This is Storm," Mason said, patting the gray's powerful neck. "Been with me since he was a colt." He helped her mount with strong, respectful hands, then swung easily into his own saddle. They rode at a leisurely pace, Mason pointing out features of the ranch, the spring-fed creek that never ran dry, the south pasture where the best grass grew, the line of cottonwoods marking the property boundary. "And that," he said eventually, reining Storm to a stop on a small rise, "is where our place will be." Abigail followed his gaze to a clearing nestled between two gentle slopes. A cabin stood partially constructed, its log walls rising toward an unfinished roof. Nearby, a small barn was taking shape. "You've done all this yourself?" she asked, amazed at the progress. "Some of the hands help when they can spare time," Mason admitted. "It's tradition when someone's building a home." They dismounted, tethering the horses to a young oak, and walked toward the cabin. Up close, Abigail could see the craftsmanship in the fitted logs and carefully framed windows. "It's not much compared to your father's place," Mason said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But the creek runs just behind, and the soil's good for a garden." Abigail stepped through the doorway, taking in the single large room with its stone fireplace and wooden floor. Sunshine streamed through the unglazed windows, highlighting the open rafters above. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. Mason looked pleased but cautious. "There will be proper walls dividing the space once it's finished. A separate bedroom for you, of course." The consideration in his words touched her. "How soon do you think it will be ready?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, he answered, running a hand along a window frame. "The glass arrives from Denver next week, and once the roof is complete, we can finish the interior." Abigail moved to the fireplace, imagining winter evenings with a crackling fire. "And then what happens?" Mason looked at her questioningly. "I mean," she clarified, "what do you expect from this marriage from me?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "I expect us to build a life here, to work together as partners do." He paused, then added, "As for the rest, friendship, perhaps in time. I won't ask for more than you're willing to give, Abigail." There was no pressure in his gaze, no hidden agenda she could discern. Just a man offering what he could: security, respect, and the possibility of something more if she chose it. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A partnership." His smile was like the breaking of dawn, slow, gradual, but transforming his entire face. "Then that's what we'll build along with this house." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property that would be their home, Mason pointing out where he planned to plant an orchard, where the garden would thrive best, how he hoped to expand the cabin as their needs grew. Through it all, Abigail found herself responding to his quiet enthusiasm, offering suggestions of her own, imagining the future in a way she hadn't dared since learning of her father's bargain with Holloway. When they returned to the Decker Ranch for the midday meal, something had shifted between them, a tentative bridge across the gulf of their hastily arranged marriage. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Mason rose before dawn to work with the ranch hands, returning mid-afternoon to spend hours on their cabin. Abigail divided her time between helping Mrs. Decker with household tasks and riding out to watch the progress on their home, often bringing food for the workers. A week after their wedding, Abigail rode to the cabin alone, having finished her chores early. She found Mason on the newly completed roof, hammering shingles into place alongside Tom Wilson and 2 other hands. "Mrs. Blackwood," Tom called down cheerfully, "come to check on your husband's handiwork." Mason looked up, a smile spreading across his face when he spotted her. "Abigail, you're early." She held up the basket she'd brought. "Mrs. Decker sent lunch. She said men working on roofs need extra feeding." The workers descended eagerly, Mason jumping lightly from the lowest beam to land beside her. "It's looking good, isn't it?" he asked, pride evident in his voice as he glanced back at the cabin. "Very good," she agreed, noting how much progress they'd made since her last visit. The roof's nearly finished. They spread the food on a makeshift table of planks and sawhorses, the men falling on Mrs. Decker's fried chicken and biscuits with appreciative groans. Abigail found herself smiling at their enthusiasm, particularly when Mason closed his eyes in bliss after biting into an apple pie. "Your mother's cooking is a gift from heaven, Tom," he declared, reaching for a second piece. "Don't let Mrs. Decker hear you praising another woman's cooking," Tom teased, winking at Abigail. "Though I reckon your wife here will give her competition soon enough." Abigail felt a flush of pleasure at being included so easily in their banter. "I'm afraid my cooking skills are modest at best," she admitted. "My father preferred simple meals." "I'm not particular," Mason assured her, his eyes warm as they met hers across the table. "Says the man who once rode 15 miles for Mrs. Wilson's apple pie." One of the other hands chimed in, prompting laughter all around. After lunch, the men returned to their work while Abigail explored the interior of the cabin, which had progressed significantly. The partition walls were framed, defining a bedroom, living area, and small kitchen. She ran her hand along the smooth, planed wood, imagining curtains at the windows and a rug before the fireplace. Lost in thought, She didn't hear Mason approach until he spoke from the doorway. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing at the space around them. "Will it do?" Abigail turned to face him, struck by the earnestness in his expression. "It's perfect, Mason, truly." Relief crossed his features. "I want you to be comfortable here." "I will be," she assured him, then hesitated before adding, "I've been thinking about what you said about being partners." His expression turned attentive. "Yes, I have some money saved," she explained. "Not much, but enough to buy fabric for curtains and perhaps a proper table and chairs. If you wouldn't mind me contributing," Mason's face softened. "I would be honored, Abigail. This is your home too. Your opinion matters as much as mine." The simple acknowledgement of her agency, something her father had never granted, filled her with unexpected emotion. She blinked rapidly, turning away to hide the sudden moisture in her eyes. A gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Abigail." "Did I say something wrong?" She shook her head, offering a watery smile. "No, just the opposite, actually." She took a steadying breath. "My father never asked what I wanted, not once in my entire life." Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes, followed by a flash of anger quickly suppressed. "Well, I'm asking. What do you want, Abigail Blackwood?" The question, asked with such sincerity, deserved an honest answer. "I want a home that's truly mine, work that matters, and someday—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "Someday I want to not be afraid of what marriage means." Mason's hand slipped from her shoulder, and for a moment she feared she'd said too much. Then his fingers found hers, entwining them in a gentle grip. "I can promise you the first two," he said, his voice low and steady. "The third, that's up to you. We have time, Abigail, all the time you need." The tenderness in his words, the patient understanding in his eyes, it was almost more than she could bear. On impulse, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. A flush spread across his tanned face, but before he could respond, Tom's voice called from outside. "Mason, we need another pair of hands up here." The moment broken, Mason stepped back, though his eyes lingered on her face. "I should get back to work." "Of course," Abigail nodded, her own cheeks warm. "I'll see you at supper." As she rode back to the Decker ranch, Abigail's fingers traced the rough calluses on her palm where Mason's hand had held hers. Something was growing between them, something tender and fragile and unexpected. Not love, perhaps, but the foundation upon which love might someday be built. For the first time since her hurried wedding, Abigail allowed herself to truly hope. The following week brought both progress and challenges. The cabin's roof was completed just in time for an unexpected summer storm that swept across the territory, bringing much-needed rain but turning the roads to mud. When the skies finally cleared 3 days later, Mason and Abigail rode out to check on their home. "No leaks," Mason announced with satisfaction after inspecting the interior. The roof held perfectly. Abigail smiled at his evident pride. "When do you think we can move in?" "Soon," he promised. "The windows arrived yesterday, and once they're installed, we'll finish the interior walls." Another week, perhaps. As they worked together that afternoon, Mason fitting glass panes while Abigail cleaned years of dust from the floor, a rider approached. Mason tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle propped against the wall before he recognized the figure. "It's just Frederick," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he returned to his task. Abigail's stomach tightened. She hadn't seen her father since her wedding day, though she'd sent a brief note letting him know she was well. Now he dismounted heavily, looking older and more weathered than she remembered. "Abigail," he greeted her stiffly. "Blackwood." Mason nodded in acknowledgement. "Mr. Monroe, what brings you this way?" Frederick's gaze swept over the cabin, assessing. "Came to see where my daughter will be living." He turned to Abigail. You look well. I am, she replied, unsure what else to say to this man who had been willing to trade her away. Would you like to see inside? Frederick followed her through the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the progress. Small, he commented. But solid, Mason countered, coming in behind them. And room to expand as needed. Frederick grunted, then reached into his coat to withdraw a small package wrapped in brown paper. Your mother's things, he said, holding it out to Abigail. Thought you might want them. Touched by the unexpected gesture, Abigail accepted the package. Thank you, Father. An awkward silence fell, broken when Mason cleared his throat. Coffee's hot if you'd like some, sir. Frederick hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Suppose I could use a cup. They sat on upturned crates around the small stove Mason had installed, sipping coffee from tin mugs. Frederick asked gruff questions about the property, the water source, Mason's plans for livestock. His manner was brusque but not hostile, and Abigail began to relax as the conversation continued. The Decker lease is working out, Frederick admitted eventually. Better terms than I expected, Mason nodded. James Decker is a fair man. And Holloway? Abigail asked cautiously. Frederick's expression darkened, still causing trouble. Been spreading talk in town, suggesting improprieties about your hasty marriage. Abigail felt her cheeks burn, but Mason's voice remained steady. People will talk. It doesn't change what's true. And what's that? Frederick challenged. Mason met his gaze directly. That I'll provide for your daughter and treat her with respect. The rest is between Abigail and me. Something like approval flickered in Frederick's eyes before he looked away. Well, just watch your back around Holloway. Man doesn't take kindly to losing. As Frederick prepared to leave an hour later, he paused beside his horse, looking uncomfortable. There's a trunk of your mother's linens in the attic, he told Abigail. You're welcome to them if you want to come by for them. It was an olive branch, however clumsily extended. Abigail nodded. I'll do that, thank you. After he'd ridden away, Mason stood beside her, his expression thoughtful. That went better than expected. Abigail smiled wryly. For my father, that was practically effusive. Mason chuckled, the sound warming her. Shall we finish those windows before sundown? As they worked side by side, Abigail found herself stealing glances at her husband, the concentration in his eyes as he carefully fitted glass into frames. The gentle strength in his hands, the way the fading sunlight caught in his hair. Each day revealed new facets of this man she had married in such haste, and each discovery made her more curious about the next. That evening, as they rode back to the Decker ranch, Mason broke their companionable silence. I was thinking we might move in by the end of the week, even if everything isn't quite finished. The bedroom and kitchen are nearly ready. Abigail's heart quickened. So soon, he glanced at her, concern crossing his features. Unless you'd prefer to wait. No, she said quickly. I'm ready. It will be good to have our own place. Our own place. The words felt right on her tongue, natural in a way she wouldn't have thought possible mere weeks ago. Mason smiled, relief evident in his expression. Then we'll make it happen. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Abigail rode into town with Maggie to purchase supplies, kitchen utensils, lamp oil, staple foods to stock their pantry. At the general store, she felt the curious stares of townspeople who had heard about her unusual marriage. But Maggie's cheerful presence helped deflect the worst of the gossip. Just ignore them, Maggie advised as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. People always talk about what they don't understand. And they don't understand why Mason would marry me so suddenly, Abigail sighed. Maggie's expression turned serious. They don't understand Mason, period. Never have. He keeps to himself, does his work, doesn't share his thoughts with many. She smiled warmly at Abigail. But I've seen how he looks at you when you're not watching. Whatever his reasons for stepping in when he did, there's more there now." Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "We're still getting to know each other." "That's how it should be," Maggie nodded approvingly. "The best marriages grow over time, like Pa always says." As they passed the saloon on their way out of town, Bernard Holloway emerged, his face flushing with anger when he spotted Abigail. She tensed, but Maggie simply clicked to the horses, increasing their pace. "Cowards," Holloway called after them, his words slightly slurred. "Tell your husband I'm not finished with him, Mrs. Blackwood." Maggie made a rude noise under her breath. "That man needs to find himself a hobby besides nursing grudges." "He frightens me," Abigail admitted quietly. "He's all talk," Maggie assured her, though her expression was troubled. "But I'll mention it to Pa, just in case." By week's end, the cabin was habitable if not fully finished. The bedroom was complete with a sturdy bed frame Mason had crafted himself. The kitchen boasted a proper stove and work table. And the main room had a comfortable settee donated by Mrs. Decker, who claimed she'd been meaning to replace it anyway. On moving day, the Deckers and several ranch hands helped transport Abigail and Mason's modest belongings to their new home. Mrs. Decker arranged Abigail's mother's linens on the bed, while Maggie helped stock the kitchen shelves. By sundown, the small cabin felt remarkably like a home. "We can't thank you enough," Abigail told the Deckers as they prepared to leave. "For everything." Mrs. Decker enveloped her in a warm hug. "Your family now, dear. That's what family does." James Decker shook Mason's hand firmly. "You've built something good here, son. Both the cabin and what's inside it." As the wagon pulled away, Abigail and Mason stood side by side in the doorway of their new home, watching until it disappeared around the bend. "Well," Mason said softly, "here we are." Abigail took a deep breath of the evening air, scented with pine and wildflowers. "Here we are." That first night in their own home brought both freedom and a new awareness of their situation. The pillow barrier that had divided the bed at the Decker Ranch seemed somehow more significant in the intimate confines of their own bedroom. "I can sleep in the main room," Mason offered as Abigail arranged the last of her belongings. "The settee is comfortable enough." She considered his offer, then shook her head. "The bed is yours too, Mason. We managed well enough at the Deckers." He nodded, though she noticed the careful distance he maintained as they prepared for sleep. When they finally settled under the covers, the pillow barrier between them felt both reassuring and oddly disappointing. "Good night, Abigail," Mason said softly, as he had every night since their wedding. "Good night, Mason," she replied, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new home, the gentle creak of settling logs, the distant call of a night bird, the steady rhythm of her husband's breathing. Life in their new home quickly established its own patterns. Mason continued working at the Double Cross during the days, while Abigail tended to their household and began planning a garden. Evenings were spent together, Mason working on finishing touches to the cabin while Abigail sewed curtains or prepared the next day's meals. They talked more freely now, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes for the future. Abigail learned that Mason had wandered for years after the war before finding a place with the Deckers, that he had a talent for sketching that he rarely indulged, that he preferred starlit nights to sunny days. In turn, she shared her love of books, her mother's lessons in herbal remedies, her dream of someday seeing the ocean. 3 weeks after moving into their cabin, Mason returned from work earlier than usual, leading a small wagon. "I have something to show you," he called as Abigail came out to greet him. Curious, she approached the wagon, peering under the canvas cover he lifted to reveal a beautiful writing desk. "Mason," she breathed, running her fingers over the polished wood. "Where did you get this?" Made it, he admitted, a hint of color touching his cheeks. Been working on it at the ranch when I had spare time. Noticed you writing your letters on your lap and thought you might like a proper desk. The thoughtfulness of the gesture overwhelmed her. Without thinking, Abigail rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a brief, sweet kiss. "Thank you," she whispered as she pulled away. "It's perfect." Mason stood very still, surprise and something warmer flickering in his eyes. Then slowly, he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "You're welcome," he said, his voice rough with emotion. That evening, as they sat before the fireplace, Mason carving a handle for a new broom, Abigail mending a shirt, the air between them felt charged with unspoken possibility. When they finally retired for the night, Mason hesitated before placing the pillows down the center of the bed. "Abigail," he began, then stopped, searching for words. She looked up at him, heart pounding. "Yes. I was thinking," he gestured at the pillows in his hands. "Perhaps we don't need these anymore." The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Abigail swallowed, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps we don't." Mason set the pillows aside, and when they settled under the covers, the space between them seemed both vast and infinitesimal. Neither moved at first, then Abigail shifted slightly closer, until her hand rested just inches from his. "Mason," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes." His voice was low, carefully controlled. "I'm glad you offered yourself instead of that land." His fingers found hers, intertwining gently. "So am I, Abigail, so am I." They fell asleep that way, hands joined in the space where the barrier had once been a small step, perhaps, but significant in the journey they had begun together. The autumn months brought a golden haze to the Wyoming landscape, as summer's green yielded to rich amber and russet. Mason and Abigail's small homestead flourished under their care, the garden producing a final harvest before winter, the barn housing 2 milk cows and a small flock of chickens, the cabin warm and inviting with Abigail's touches evident in every corner. Their relationship, too, had blossomed in unexpected ways. The pillow barrier remained abandoned, and though they still moved carefully around the more intimate aspects of marriage, they had discovered the simple joy of falling asleep in each other's arms, of morning conversations shared in the quiet moments before dawn, of learning each other's habits and preferences. One crisp October morning, Abigail stood at the stove preparing breakfast when Mason entered from his early chores, bringing with him the scent of frost and wood smoke. "Cold out there," he observed, hanging his coat by the door. "Winter's coming early this year." "Maggie said the same when I saw her yesterday," Abigail replied, handing him a cup of steaming coffee. "The Deckers are hosting a harvest dance next weekend. She insisted we attend." Mason accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "Been a while since I've done any dancing." "Are you saying you don't want to go?" Abigail asked, trying to mask her disappointment. She had been looking forward to the social event, their first as a couple. "Not at all," he corrected quickly. "Just warning you that I might step on your toes." She laughed, relief warming her. "I'll wear sturdy boots." As they ate breakfast, Mason mentioned that he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Anything you need while I'm there. Thread, if Mr. Peterson has any blue to match this," Abigail said, indicating the dress she was mending. "And perhaps some more coffee." "We're running low." Mason nodded, finishing his breakfast. "I might be late getting back. James wants me to look at a horse he's considering buying." "I'll keep supper warm," she promised. After Mason departed, Abigail spent the morning preserving the last of the garden vegetables and planning what she might wear to the harvest dance. Around midday, she heard a horse approaching and went to the door, expecting to see Mason returning for the forgotten list he'd left on the table. Instead, Bernard Holloway sat astride his expensive stallion, his florid face set in an unpleasant smile. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "What a pleasure to find you at home." Abigail's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Mr. Holloway." "My husband isn't here." "I know," Holloway said, dismounting slowly. "Saw him in town not an hour ago. Thought it might be a good opportunity for us to have a private conversation." Alarm flickered through Abigail. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Holloway." He approached the porch, his boot heels thudding heavily on the wooden steps. "Oh, I think you do. You see, I've been thinking about our arrangement, the one your father so rudely abandoned." "There was no arrangement between us," Abigail said firmly. "Only between you and my father, and that's finished now." Holloway's smile hardened. "Nothing's finished until I say it is." He reached the top step, too close for comfort. "You were promised to me, Abigail. I don't take kindly to broken promises." Abigail stepped back into the doorway. "Please leave, Mr. Holloway. I have nothing more to say to you." "Your father's in trouble, did you know that?" Holloway said, ignoring her request. "The lease with Decker is helping, but it's not enough. He's behind on his bank payments, could lose everything by spring." The news struck Abigail like a physical blow. Her father hadn't mentioned financial troubles during his infrequent visits. "That's unfortunate," she managed, "but it doesn't change anything between us." Holloway's expression turned calculating. "I could help him, of course. Buy his place outright, let him stay on as tenant. All he needs to do is convince you to reconsider our arrangement." "I'm married," Abigail reminded him, anger rising through her fear. "Happily married. Marriages can be annulled," Holloway said with a dismissive wave. "Especially hasty ones that might not have been consummated." His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Abigail's cheeks burned with both embarrassment and fury. "Get off my property, Mr. Holloway, now." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "You've developed quite a backbone since running off with that saddle tramp. Perhaps we should discuss this inside where it's more comfortable." He moved toward the door. Abigail retreated into the cabin, reaching for the rifle Mason kept beside the door. She raised it with shaking hands. "Not another step." Holloway froze, surprise quickly giving way to rage. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," she replied, finding strength in her fear. "My husband taught me to shoot, said it was important for a woman alone to protect herself." For a tense moment, they faced each other in silence, Holloway calculating his options while Abigail fought to keep the rifle steady. Finally, he stepped back. "This isn't over," he promised, his voice low with menace. "Your father will pay for his deception, and that husband of yours will regret the day he interfered in my business." "Leave," Abigail commanded, the rifle unwavering despite her trembling. Holloway retreated down the steps, mounting his horse with fluid grace that belied his age. "Give your husband my regards," he called as he wheeled his stallion around. "Tell him to watch his back." Abigail maintained her position until he disappeared from sight, then slowly lowered the rifle, her arms aching from the tension. She sank into a chair, her entire body shaking with delayed reaction. When Mason returned hours later, he found her still sitting by the cold stove, the unfired rifle across her lap. "Abigail." Alarm filled his voice as he crossed the room in quick strides. "What happened?" The sight of his concerned face broke something inside her. Tears she had refused to shed in Holloway's presence now flowed freely as Mason knelt beside her chair, his hands gently covering hers on the rifle. "Tell me," he urged softly. Through halting words, she recounted Holloway's visit, his threats against her father and Mason, his insinuations about their marriage. Mason's expression darkened with each word, but his touch remained gentle as he took the rifle and set it aside, then gathered her into his arms. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair. "I shouldn't have left you alone." "You couldn't have known," Abigail replied, her face pressed against his shoulder. "But Mason, what if he's right about my father? What if he loses everything?" Mason was quiet for a moment, his hands making soothing circles on her back. "We'll help him if it comes to that. There's room for him here if needed." The simple offer, made without hesitation despite the troubled history between the two men, filled Abigail with a rush of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. She pulled back slightly to look into his face. "You mean that?" she asked softly. "Of course," Mason replied, his eyes steady on hers. "He's your father, Abigail. That makes him family. Family." The word echoed in her mind as she studied the face of this man who had changed her life so dramatically. The firm line of his jaw softened now with concern. The small scar above his right eyebrow that she had learned came from falling from a horse as a boy. The eyes that watched her with such tender regard. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could consider them. Mason went very still, surprise flickering across his features before they softened into something so beautiful it made her heart ache. "Say that again," he requested, his voice rough with emotion. Abigail smiled through her tears. "I love you, Mason Blackwood." His hands came up to frame her face with infinite care. "I have loved you since the first time I saw you at church last spring," he confessed. "Your hair was coming loose from your bonnet, and you smiled at old Mrs. Jenkins when no one else would sit beside her. You remember that?" Abigail asked, amazed. "I remember everything about you," Mason said simply. "The way you bite your lip when you're thinking, how you hum to yourself while you work in the garden, the sound of your laughter." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Abigail closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held all the emotion of the past months, the fear, the uncertainty, the growing tenderness, and now, finally, love acknowledged. When they eventually parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "No one will hurt you, Abigail, not Holloway, not anyone, I promise you that. I'm not afraid for myself," she admitted. "It's you and my father I worry for. Holloway is a dangerous man." "We'll face him together," Mason assured her, rising and drawing her to her feet. "But first, I think we should talk to your father, find out exactly how bad things are." The next morning they rode to the Monroe homestead, finding Frederick in the barn mending harness. He looked up in surprise at their arrival, his expression guarded. "Abigail, Blackwood." "Wasn't expecting company." "Father," Abigail dismounted, handing her reins to Mason. "We need to talk about Bernard Holloway." Frederick's face closed off immediately. "Nothing to discuss. Haven't seen the man in weeks." "He came to our cabin yesterday," Abigail said firmly. "Threatened both of you, said you're having financial troubles." A muscle ticked in Frederick's jaw. "Holloway talks too much." "Is it true?" Mason asked, coming to stand beside Abigail. "Are you in danger of losing the farm?" Frederick remained silent for a long moment, pride warring with practicality in his weathered face. Finally, he sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. "Bank's calling in the loan come spring," he admitted. "Can't make the payments with what I'm earning, even with Decker's lease." "Why didn't you tell me?" Abigail asked, hurt by his silence. Frederick's expression hardened. "You have your own life now, your own concerns." "You're still my father," she countered. "And you're still as stubborn as your mother," he muttered, though a hint of affection softened the words. Mason stepped forward. "Mr. Monroe, we'd like to help. There's room at our place if you need somewhere to go." Frederick looked genuinely startled by the offer. "You'd take me in, after what I tried to do to Abigail. The past is past," Mason said simply. "Family stands together." Something shifted in Frederick's expression, respect, perhaps, or the beginning of it. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready to give up yet. Still have a few months to find a solution. What about selling some of your cattle? Abigail suggested. Just enough to make the payment. Frederick shook his head. Already sold what I could spare. Need the rest for breeding stock, or I'll have nothing left come calving season. They discussed various options, none entirely satisfactory, until Mason mentioned a possibility that surprised both Monroes. The Army's looking for good horses, he said. James Decker mentioned it yesterday. They're paying top dollar for cavalry mounts. If we combined our stock, we might have enough to interest them. Frederick looked thoughtful. How many do they want? 20 head minimum, Mason replied. I have 8 that would qualify if you have 12 or so. I might, Frederick admitted slowly, but they'd need to be trained to Army specifications. I can handle that, Mason assured him. I worked with cavalry mounts during the war. For the first time, genuine interest sparked in Frederick's eyes. Might work at that. When are they buying? Purchasing agent arrives next month, Mason said. Gives us time to prepare the horses. As they hammered out the details of their plan, Abigail watched the two men with growing hope. This unexpected partnership might save her father's farm, but more importantly, it marked a new beginning between the two most important men in her life. The harvest dance at the Decker Ranch arrived amid bustling preparations for the Army horse sale. Abigail wore her best dress, a deep blue that Mason said matched the evening sky, with her honey-brown hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. You look beautiful, Mason told her as he helped her into the wagon, his eyes warm with admiration. Abigail smiled, taking in his own carefully groomed appearance, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing the new shirt she had finished just the day before. You're quite handsome yourself, Mr. Blackwood. The Decker barn had been transformed for the occasion, hay bales arranged for seating around the edges, lanterns hanging from the rafters casting a golden glow over the proceedings. A small band played lively tunes while couples whirled across the floor. Abigail, Mason. Maggie called, waving enthusiastically from across the barn. You're finally here. The evening passed in a blur of music, laughter, and conversation. Abigail danced not only with Mason, who proved more skilled than he had claimed, but also with James Decker, Tom Wilson, and several other ranch hands. Between dances, she chatted with neighboring women, slowly building friendships in this community that was becoming hers. During a break in the music, she found herself standing beside Mrs. Wilson, Tom's mother, watching as Mason conversed with a group of men across the room. Your husband's a good man, Mrs. Wilson commented, following Abigail's gaze. Always was, even when he first came here with nothing but that gray horse and shadows in his eyes. Shadows? Abigail asked, curious. The older woman nodded. War leaves marks on a man, not all of them visible. Mason had his share when James hired him. She smiled softly. But those shadows have been fading since you came along, Mrs. Blackwood. Before Abigail could respond, the band struck up a slower tune, and Mason appeared at her side, hand extended in invitation. May I have this dance, Mrs. Blackwood? He asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. As they moved together on the dance floor, Mason held her closer than propriety might strictly allow, but Abigail found she didn't mind. The solid warmth of him, the gentle pressure of his hand at her waist, the faint scent of soap and leather that was uniquely his, all of it felt right, like coming home. Happy, he murmured near her ear. Very, she replied, allowing herself to lean slightly into his embrace. Thank you for bringing me tonight. Thank you for making me brave enough to dance, he countered with a smile. As the music drew to a close, Mason's expression turned more serious. "Abigail, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What is it?" she asked, noting the sudden tension in his shoulders. Before he could continue, James Decker called for everyone's attention, raising a glass in toast to the bountiful harvest, and the community gathered to celebrate it. The moment was lost as people cheered and drank, and the band launched into another lively tune. Later, as they drove home under a canopy of stars, Abigail remembered his unasked question. "What were you going to say earlier, before Mr. Decker's toast?" Mason was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead. "I was going to ask if you'd be disappointed if we expanded the cabin sooner than planned." Abigail frowned slightly, confused. "Why would that disappoint me?" He glanced at her, then back at the road. "Because the reason for expanding would be to make room for a nursery." The implication of his words took a moment to register. When they did, Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "A nursery, you mean, if you wanted," Mason said quickly. "If you felt ready for that, for children." The wagon rolled on through the darkness as Abigail considered his words. Children, a family of their own. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "I do want children," she said finally, "with you, but, he prompted gently when she hesitated. "But I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of motherhood itself, but of how it might change us. What we have now is still so new." Mason guided the horses around a bend in the road before responding. "My mother once told me that love doesn't divide when shared with children, it multiplies." He reached for her hand in the darkness. "Whatever comes, Abigail, we'll face it together. No rush, no pressure. When you're ready." The tenderness in his voice, the respect for her feelings, it was everything her father's arrangement with Holloway had lacked. This was what a true partnership looked like. "I think," she said softly, squeezing his hand, "that I might be ready to start thinking about it." Mason's smile was visible even in the dim starlight. "Then we'll think about it, together." The days leading up to the Army purchasing agent's arrival were filled with intense activity. Mason split his time between his regular duties at the Double Cross and working with Frederick to prepare the horses, while Abigail kept both households running smoothly, riding between the two properties with meals and clean clothes. One evening, as she approached her father's barn with a basket of supper, she overheard a snippet of conversation that made her pause outside the door. "Never thanked you properly," her father was saying, his voice gruff with uncharacteristic emotion. "No need for thanks," Mason replied. "I did what anyone would do." Frederick snorted. "No, what you did offering yourself in place of Holloway's land deal, that wasn't what anyone would do. That took a special kind of courage, or foolishness," Mason said, a smile evident in his voice, "depending on who you ask." "Not foolishness," Frederick insisted. "I was the fool trying to barter my own daughter like she was livestock." A heavy pause followed. "I see how she looks at you now, how you look at her. Whatever your reasons were then, it's clear enough what they are now." "I love her," Mason said simply. "Have from the start, though I had no right to hope she might ever feel the same." "But she does," Frederick stated rather than asked. "Yes," Mason confirmed, and Abigail could hear the wonder still present in that single word. "She does." "Then I was wrong about you, Blackwood, and I'm grateful that you proved me so." Abigail blinked back unexpected tears, then deliberately scuffed her boots on the ground before entering the barn, pretending she hadn't overheard their conversation. But the knowledge of it warmed her throughout the evening, a private joy she carried close to her heart. The Army purchasing agent, a crisp lieutenant named Harris, arrived exactly when expected, accompanied by 2 sergeants and a clerk. He inspected the combined herd of horses with professional detachment, noting the animals' conformation, temperament, and training with quick efficiency. "You've done fine work, gentlemen," he commented as the final horse was demonstrated. The Army would be pleased to purchase 18 of the 23 you've presented. Frederick and Mason exchanged satisfied glances. Even with 5 horses rejected, the sale would bring enough to save the Monroe farm and leave some profit besides. As for price, Lieutenant Harris continued, consulting his notes, I am authorized to offer $80 per head. Frederick frowned. The notice said 100. For exceptional animals, yes, Harris agreed. These are good horses, but only a few meet our highest standards. Mason stepped forward. Which ones do you consider exceptional? The lieutenant indicated 5 horses, including Storm, Mason's prized stallion. These would command the full 100. A tense negotiation followed, with Mason and Frederick advocating for their stock while Harris remained firm on his evaluations. Eventually, they settled on a compromise, $90 each for 10 horses and the full 100 for the best 8, including Storm. As the paperwork was being completed, Abigail approached Mason. You're selling Storm, she asked quietly. But he's been with you forever. Mason nodded, his expression carefully neutral. He's the best of the lot. The Army needs good horses, and the money will secure your father's farm. But he's not just a horse to you, Abigail protested. He's family. A sad smile touched Mason's lips. Sometimes we have to let go of one part of our family to protect another. He glanced toward Frederick, who was signing the final documents. Your father needs this, Abigail. I can find another horse. The sacrifice touched her deeply. Storm had been Mason's companion through years of wandering, had carried him to Wyoming, had even been present at their wedding. To give him up for her father's sake demonstrated a generosity of spirit that left her speechless. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed in their small cabin, Abigail finally found words for her feelings. Thank you, she said simply, wrapping her arms around Mason from behind as he stood by the wash basin. For Storm, for everything. He turned within the circle of her arms, his hands coming to rest at her waist. Your father's important to you. That makes him important to me. Abigail reached up to trace the line of his jaw, still damp from washing. I love you, Mason Blackwood, more than I ever thought possible. His eyes darkened with emotion as he leaned down to capture her lips in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with shared passion. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I've been waiting to hear those words again, he admitted softly. I'll say them every day, Abigail promised, if you'll do the same. I love you, Abigail Blackwood, he whispered against her lips. Today, tomorrow, always. That night the last barriers between them fell away as naturally as autumn leaves yielding to winter's approach. In the warmth of their bed, with moonlight spilling through the curtains Abigail had sewn with her own hands, they discovered each other fully at last, not as strangers bound by a hasty arrangement, but as partners who had chosen each other with open eyes and full hearts. Winter came early to Wyoming that year, as Mason had predicted. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the landscape into a pristine wonderland of white. From the window of their snug cabin, Abigail watched fat flakes drift lazily from a pearl-gray sky, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. It's beautiful, she said as Mason joined her, his arm slipping comfortably around her waist. Beautiful, he agreed, though his eyes were on her face rather than the snow. How are you feeling this morning? Abigail smiled, leaning into his embrace. Better. The tea Mrs. Wilson recommended helped. The morning sickness that had plagued her for the past week was their secret, for now a joyful one they planned to share with family and friends at the Thanksgiving gathering the Deckers were hosting. At 2 months along, Abigail's condition wasn't yet visible, but the glow of impending motherhood had already softened her features. "Good." Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "I worry about you." "Needlessly," she assured him. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my baby," he countered with a smile. "That makes it different." A knock at the door interrupted their moment of quiet intimacy. Mason frowned slightly. Visitors were rare in such weather and moved to answer it. Frederick Monroe stood on their porch, hat in hand, snow dusting his shoulders. "Blackwood," he greeted Mason, then peered past him. "Abigail, hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Father," Abigail said warmly, gesturing him inside. "Come in out of the cold." As Frederick stomped snow from his boots, Abigail busied herself preparing fresh coffee. The relationship between her father and husband had evolved over the past months into something resembling mutual respect, if not quite friendship. "What brings you out in this weather?" Mason asked, taking Frederick's coat. Frederick accepted a cup of coffee from Abigail before answering. "Had a visitor yesterday. Thought you should know." Something in his tone put both Blackwoods on alert. "Holloway," Mason guessed, his posture tensing. Frederick nodded grimly. "Came by with an offer to buy my place again. Said since I managed to pay the bank, maybe I'd be interested in selling outright and retiring comfortably." "What did you tell him?" Abigail asked, though she already knew the answer. "Told him I'd die before I sold to him," Frederick said bluntly. "He didn't take it well." Mason's expression hardened. "Threats?" "Nothing specific," Frederick admitted. "Just said I might regret my decision when winter really sets in. Implied accidents happen easily in bad weather." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Abigail's hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach, a protective gesture that didn't escape her father's notice. "There's something else you're not telling me," he said, eyes narrowing slightly. Abigail glanced at Mason, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "We were planning to announce it at Thanksgiving, but—" She took a deep breath. "I'm expecting a baby, Father, due in early summer." Frederick's weathered face underwent a remarkable transformation surprise, followed by a softening Abigail hadn't seen since her mother was alive. "A baby," he repeated, something like wonder in his voice. "I'm going to be a grandfather." "Yes," Abigail confirmed, smiling at his reaction. "You are." Frederick set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Well then," he said gruffly, "all the more reason to deal with Holloway once and for all." "What do you suggest?" Mason asked, coming to stand beside Abigail, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Been thinking on that," Frederick replied. "Man like Holloway operates in shadows. Maybe it's time to bring things into the light." By the time Frederick left that afternoon, they had formulated a plan. Mason would ride to town the next day to speak with Sheriff Davis about Holloway's threats, while Frederick would contact the bank manager about suspicious inquiries Holloway had made regarding the Monroe mortgage. "Be careful," Abigail urged as she embraced her father goodbye. "Don't confront him alone." Frederick patted her awkwardly on the back. "Don't you worry about me, girl. Survived worse than Bernard Holloway in my time." After he'd gone, Mason pulled Abigail close, his chin resting on top of her head. "He'll be all right. Frederick Monroe's too stubborn to let anyone get the better of him." "Just like his daughter," Abigail murmured against Mason's chest. His chuckle rumbled through her. "Exactly like his daughter. Poor child doesn't stand a chance with that bloodline." "Poor child has a wonderful father to balance things out," she countered, tilting her face up to his. Mason's expression grew serious. "I want to be a good father, Abigail, better than mine was, better than yours tried to be." "You will be," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "You already are a good man. The rest will follow naturally." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the snow glittering like diamond dust in the early light. Mason prepared for his ride to town, dressing in his warmest clothes and checking his pistol before holstering it. "I should be back by nightfall," he told Abigail as he pulled on his heavy coat. "Stay inside, keep the fire going." "I will," she promised, handing him a package of food for the journey. "Be careful on those roads." He kissed her goodbye, his lips lingering on hers as though memorizing their feel. "Lock the door behind me," he reminded her before stepping out into the brilliant winter morning. Abigail watched from the window as he mounted the bay gelding that had replaced Storm in their small stable, waving as he rode away. She spent the morning on household tasks, baking bread, mending a tear in Mason's work shirt, writing a letter to Maggie about her pregnancy. Mid-afternoon brought the sound of approaching horses. Expecting Mason's return, Abigail moved to the window with a smile that froze on her lips when she saw 3 riders approaching, none of them her husband. Bernard Holloway led the group, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Abigail had seen occasionally in town. All 3 wore expressions that sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. Moving quickly, she retrieved the loaded rifle from beside the door, checking that it was ready to fire. This time she wouldn't hesitate if threatened. "Mrs. Blackwood," Holloway called as they reined to a stop before the cabin. "A word, if you please." "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Holloway," Abigail replied through the closed door. "Please leave my property." "Ah, but I have something important to tell you," Holloway insisted, his voice carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction that raised the hairs on the back of Abigail's neck. "About your husband." Despite herself, Abigail's heart skipped a beat. "What about him?" "There's been an accident," Holloway said, false concern dripping from his words. "On the road to town. Ice can be so treacherous this time of year." Fear clutched at Abigail's throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't believe you." "No." Holloway dismounted, producing something from his saddlebag. "Perhaps this will convince you." He held up a familiar object, Mason's hat, the one he had placed on Frederick Monroe's table months ago when he had offered himself in place of Holloway's land deal. "Where did you get that?" Abigail demanded, her voice steady despite the terror building inside her. "Told you. There was an accident." Holloway tossed the hat onto the porch. "Your husband won't be coming home, Mrs. Blackwood, but don't worry, I'm here to take care of you now." "Like hell you are," came a voice from behind the intruders. All heads turned to see Frederick Monroe emerging from the tree line, rifle raised and aimed squarely at Holloway's chest. "Monroe," Holloway spat. "Should have known you'd be skulking about." "This is my daughter's home," Frederick replied evenly. "Where else would I be when vermin come calling?" Holloway's companions shifted uneasily, hands drifting toward their weapons. "You're outnumbered, old man." "Am I?" Frederick's gaze flickered briefly to the right. Following his glance, Abigail saw movement among the trees. James Decker and several of his ranch hands, including Tom Wilson, all armed and approaching cautiously. "Seems to me you're the one outnumbered, Holloway," Frederick observed with grim satisfaction. Holloway's face darkened with rage. "This changes nothing. Blackwood's still dead, and this property will be mine one way or another." "You're wrong on both counts," came another voice, one that made Abigail's heart leap with joy and relief. Mason emerged from the opposite tree line, leading his horse, very much alive though sporting a bloody gash on his forehead. "Sorry I'm late, Abigail," he called. "Had some trouble on the road." The look of shock on Holloway's face might have been comical under different circumstances. "Impossible," he sputtered. Your men are currently enjoying Sheriff Davis's hospitality," Mason informed him coldly. "Attempted murder carries a heavy sentence in this territory, Holloway." Abigail threw open the door, rifle still in hand but all her attention on Mason as he approached the cabin. "You're hurt," she said, noting the dried blood that had traced a path down his temple. "It's nothing," he assured her, his eyes never leaving Holloway as he climbed the porch steps to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" "I am now," she replied truthfully. With the Decker men closing in from one side and Frederick holding steady from the other, Holloway and his remaining companions found themselves thoroughly surrounded. "It's over, Holloway," James Decker announced, his normally friendly face hard with anger. "Sheriff's on his way. You're finished in this territory." For a moment, it seemed Holloway might attempt something desperate. His hand hovered near his pistol, his eyes darting between the various threats surrounding him. Then, with a visible effort, he straightened his shoulders. "This isn't over," he declared, though the bluster had left his voice. "No jury will convict a man of my standing on the word of a drifter and a failed farmer." "Perhaps not," Mason agreed mildly, "but they might convict you based on this." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat pocket. "A signed confession from the men you hired to ambush me. Seems they weren't willing to hang for a man who paid them as poorly as you did." All color drained from Holloway's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Mason held his gaze steadily. "Care to wager your future on that?" The standoff lasted only moments longer before the distant sound of approaching riders heralded Sheriff Davis's arrival. With grim efficiency, the lawman arrested Holloway and his remaining henchmen, confiscating their weapons and binding their hands. "You'll regret this," Holloway snarled as he was led away. "All of you. The only regret I have," Mason replied quietly, "is not seeing through you sooner." As the sheriff's party disappeared down the road, Abigail finally allowed herself to tremble, the rifle slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers to be caught by Mason's quick hands. "It's all right," he murmured, setting the weapon aside to gather her close. "It's over now. We're safe." Over his shoulder, Abigail met her father's gaze. Frederick nodded once, a gesture containing both acknowledgement of Mason's worth and silent gratitude for her safety. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to approval he had ever offered. That evening, after the excitement had faded and their friends had returned to their own homes, Abigail tended to Mason's wound by the firelight, her touch gentle as she cleaned away the dried blood. "How did you know?" she asked. "That Holloway would make his move today." Mason winced slightly as she applied a salve to the cut. "I didn't, not exactly, but after what your father told us, it seemed likely he'd try something while I was away." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I asked Decker to keep an eye on the place, just in case." "And your accident?" she prompted. A grim smile touched his lips. "Two of Holloway's men tried to ambush me about 5 miles from town. They weren't expecting me to be watching for trouble." Abigail shuddered at how differently things might have ended. "Thank God you were prepared." "I would never leave you unprotected," Mason said seriously. "You or our child." She placed his hand against her still flat stomach, both of them silent for a moment as they contemplated the new life growing there, a life created from what had begun as an arrangement of necessity, but had blossomed into something far more precious. "What happens now?" Abigail asked finally. "With Holloway, he'll stand trial," Mason replied. "With the evidence against him, he'll likely spend years in prison. His days of threatening this family are over." Family. The word settled around them like a comfortable blanket, warm and secure. From the most unlikely beginning, her father's attempt to trade her for land, Mason's impulsive offer of himself instead had grown this deep and abiding love, this partnership that faced each challenge together. "I was thinking," Mason said after a comfortable silence, "that we might add that nursery sooner rather than later. The baby will be here by summer and we should be prepared." Abigail smiled, imagining their home expanded to accommodate their growing family. "I'd like that. Perhaps a larger kitchen too while we're at it. Anything you want," he promised, drawing her into his arms. "This home is ours to shape however we choose." As the winter night deepened around their small cabin, Abigail rested in the certainty of Mason's embrace, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought them together. What her father had intended as a transaction had become transformation instead of her life, of Mason's, and ultimately of Frederick himself. Spring arrived with a rush of new life, tender green shoots pushing through thawing earth, birds returning to build nests in the eaves of the expanded cabin, and Abigail's body blossoming with the child she carried. Her 5th month brought the first fluttering movements that made the baby's presence undeniably real. "Here," she said one evening, guiding Mason's hand to a spot where their child had been particularly active. "Can you feel that?" The wonder on his face when he felt the tiny kick against his palm was something Abigail knew she would remember always. "That's our baby," he whispered, awe filling his voice. "Our baby," she echoed, covering his hand with her own. "I think it's a boy. He kicks like he's trying to break broncos already." Mason laughed, a carefree sound that had become more common as the months passed. "A boy with his mother's spirit, then. Heaven help us all." The nursery was completed by the time the first wildflowers bloomed across the prairie. Mason had crafted a beautiful cradle from pine wood, its edges sanded smooth as silk, while Abigail sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, each stitch a testament to her love for the child she had yet to meet. Frederick, to everyone's surprise, had taken to the prospect of grandfatherhood with unexpected enthusiasm. He visited regularly, often bringing small gifts: a hand-carved wooden horse, a quilt his wife had made years ago, preserved for just such an occasion. "Your mother would have been so pleased," he told Abigail during one such visit, his usual gruffness softened by nostalgia. "She always wanted grandchildren." "She would have loved being a grandmother," Abigail agreed, touched by this rare mention of her mother. "And she would have been proud of you, father, for everything you've done." Frederick looked away, uncomfortable with the sentiment. "Done plenty I'm not proud of," he muttered. "Trying to trade you to Holloway tops that list." "But without that," Abigail pointed out gently, "I might never have married Mason." Her father considered this, then nodded slowly. "Suppose even old fools like me can accidentally do something right now and then." On a warm June evening, with summer's golden light stretching long across the valley, Abigail's labor began. Mason sent for both the midwife and Maggie Decker, who had promised to assist when the time came, then settled in for the long vigil of a first-time father. "I'll be fine," Abigail assured him as the first pains washed over her. "Women have been doing this forever." "Not my wife," Mason replied, echoing his words from months earlier. "That makes it different." The labor progressed through the night, Mason a constant presence despite the midwife's attempts to banish him to the porch with Frederick, who had arrived shortly after sunset and paced anxiously outside, wearing a path in the grass. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Abigail gave a final push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Mason's eyes. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Abigail's chest. "Strong and healthy as can be." Abigail gazed down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed by a love so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Mason sat beside them on the bed, one arm supporting Abigail while his other hand gently touched their son's downy head. "He's perfect," he said, voice rough with emotion. Just like his mother. After the midwife had cleaned and swaddled the baby, Mason carried his son to the porch where Frederick waited. "Your grandson," he announced simply, placing the bundle in the older man's arms. Frederick stared down at the infant with undisguised wonder. "He has Abigail's eyes," he observed gruffly, "and her mother's chin." "We thought to name him Frederick James," Mason said, "if that would be acceptable to you." The older man's head snapped up, surprise evident in his weathered face. "After me. After everything," Mason nodded. "Family remembers both the good and the bad, sir, but mostly the good." A suspicious moisture gathered in Frederick's eyes as he looked back down at his namesake. "Frederick James Blackwood," he tested the name. "Strong name for a strong boy." "A name with history," Mason agreed. "And a future all his own to make." As summer ripened toward harvest, the Blackwood homestead flourished. Young Frederick, already nicknamed Freddie by his adoring parents, grew strong and curious about the world around him. Abigail recovered quickly from childbirth, soon resuming her work in the garden and kitchen, though now with a small bundle secured to her chest in a sling Mason had designed based on one he'd seen used by native women. Their first anniversary arrived with little fanfare but deep significance. After Freddie was asleep in his cradle, Mason presented Abigail with a small carved box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a delicate gold locket nestled inside. "Open it," Mason encouraged. Inside, she found a tiny sketch he had drawn Abigail holding Freddie, their profiles captured with remarkable skill. On the opposite side was a lock of the baby's dark hair. "Mason," she breathed, deeply touched by the thoughtful gift. "It's beautiful. But when did you have time to draw this?" He smiled, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. "I have my moments. Usually when you're both asleep and I should be too, but can't stop looking at you." Abigail touched the locket where it rested against her heart. "I love it, and I love you more than I ever thought possible. Even though I arrived in your life under such strange circumstances," he asked, only half joking. She reached up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "Because of how you arrived in some ways. You offered yourself instead of land when you barely knew me. You gave me choices when others would have given orders. You built this life with me, brick by brick, day by day." Mason caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "And I'd do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you and Freddie." Outside their window, the Wyoming sky stretched endless, and star-filled above the land they had made their own. Inside, the small family Mason and Abigail had created slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a desperate bargain had transformed into the most precious gift of all, a love freely given, freely accepted, and growing stronger with each passing day. Frederick Monroe never remarried, but he didn't remain alone. As Freddie grew and was joined by a sister, Mary, 2 years later, the Monroe and Blackwood farms gradually operated as one extended family property. The Army continued to buy their horses, their cattle thrived, and the land that had once nearly been traded for Abigail's future instead became the legacy she and Mason built together for their children. Bernard Holloway served 5 years in territorial prison before being released, a broken man with little of his former influence remaining. He left Wyoming without a backward glance, never to trouble the Blackwoods or Monroes again. The Double Cross Ranch remained a cornerstone of their lives, with James and Mrs. Decker becoming honorary grandparents to the Blackwood children. Maggie eventually married Tom Wilson, building their own home nearby and adding their children to the extended family that gathered for holidays and harvest celebrations. On their 10th anniversary, Mason surprised Abigail with a journey to California, fulfilling her long-ago expressed wish to see the ocean. Standing on the Pacific shore, watching the endless waves crash against the sand, Abigail turned to the man who had changed her life with a simple, courageous act. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying a decade of gratitude and love. Mason drew her close, the silver beginning to thread through his hair, catching the golden California sunlight. "For what?" "For putting down your hat that day," she replied simply. "For offering yourself instead." His smile, still capable of making her heart skip after all these years, spread slowly across his face. "Best bargain I ever made," he declared, bending to seal the words with a kiss as timeless as the ocean beside them, and as boundless as the love they had built together from the most unlikely of beginnings.